and institutional communities. And in this panel, we have two speakers that are here with us, Eti and Noah, and two speakers that will join us via Zoom, Ken and Sasha. So we'll start with Noah. Noah Drezner is a professor of higher education and also the director of the higher education and post-secondary education program and at the Teachers College, Columbia University, and he is the principal investigator of the Tzedakah lab at the Teachers College of Columbia University, and the founding editor of Philanthropy and Education Journal. Noah's research deal with issues of philanthropy and fundraising as they pertain to colleges and university, and including higher education's role in cultivating of pro-social behaviors. And Noah will address us with the issue of selective scrutiny, philanthropy, and free speech. Noah, thank you for joining us, and the floor is yours. We have about 15 minutes or so, right? For each of us.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm taking. You can hear yourself. Delay. Okay. I'm really excited to be here. I understand that I'm feeling the slump of a heavy meal as well. So, but excellent discussion beforehand as well to motivate us this afternoon. My presentation today explores how there is an emerging categorization of financial pressures when it comes from within the faculty versus external donors going on. Particularly, I'm looking at the U.S. case. The title Selective Scrutiny reflects the core argument that higher education's reaction to financial pressure is often predicated on the identity of the actor rather than the impact on the institution. I hope we're going to explore the idea that we treat donor expression and faculty tactics, therefore currently differently. The way that I'm structuring my argument today is to briefly talk about the purpose of higher education, introduce you a little bit to those who are not aware of the philanthropy's impact on U.S. higher education, talk a little bit about how I define financial activism and the tensions between academic boycotts and donor activism, and then look a little bit more into what I believe is a double standard that the American Association of University Professors has set up for us, and finally end very briefly with proposing a way forward to look at this, and with hopefully to consider ethical consistency and transparency in our decisions. Higher education's mission centers on fostering critical thinking and ethical leadership. This depends entirely on academic freedom to protect societal's exploration. We've heard much about that today. As Howard Bowen argued in 1974, and I believe is still correct over 50 years later, is that private philanthropy has historically been an important device for protecting, not just funding, that very intellectual freedom. In 2023, donors gave over $50 billion to U.S. colleges, but that only amounted to about what averages to about 10% of institutional budgets. Of course, there are some very wealthy institutions where it is much more than 10%, but when we look across the entire sector, it amounts to about 10% of the budgets. It is the primary driver for access, research, and the building of different academic freedoms, and initiatives that might otherwise be neglected, such as sustaining supports for historically black colleges and universities and other minority-serving institutions in the United States, or increasingly through the acts of massive philanthropy, zero tuition-based programs, for instance with Ruth Gottesman, which is a very well-known name here in Israel, giving $1 billion to the Einstein College of Medicine in the Bronx that primarily serves underserved populations to create a free medical college. I will say it's very exciting to talk about a $1 billion donation to give free medical care to free medical school to Einstein College of Medicine, but as a professor of Teachers College, her graduate degree, her doctorate is from Teachers College, and we wish that we would have gotten the $1 billion to give free education degrees, although we're lucky that she might have an extra $1 billion to spare if we're lucky enough. I propose that we view both academic boycotts and donor activism under the same umbrella of financial activism. When faculty boycott, especially when they choose to boycott external institutions, they are not just making a moral statement, they are imposing economic costs. When donors withdraw funding, they are doing the same. The underlying logic is identical. Each seeks to realign institutional resources with specific ethical or political commitments. To understand the selective scrutiny that I'm talking about, we have to look at these two specific movements. On one hand, we have BDS. Whether you agree with its politics or not, from a functional perspective, it's a form of financial activism. It seeks to impose economic and reputational costs on institutions. On the other hand, we have the American Association of University Professors, or AAUP's, longstanding protection of the university from donor activism. The AAUP has historically been successful in framing donor pressure as a coercive and external threat to higher education. They believe that this is through creating strings on gifts, or through the form of coercion that might exist and undermining faculty's role in shared governance. I argue that we are now in a contradictory moment, though. The AAUP has moved towards a position that justifies faculty-led pressure, or BDS, as, quote, a legitimate tactic, while simultaneously maintaining that donor-led financial pressure is a violation of academic integrity. This is the heart of the double standard. The AAUP and others are scrutinizing the source of the money rather than the nature of the pressure. The AAUP recently underwent a significant shift. For years, it warned that academic boycotts undermined core values by limiting dialogue and limiting the academic freedom of the faculty members and students of those institutions that were being boycotted. However, the revised 2025 position, although it was first discussed in December of 2023 and only went through the entire process of being approved in 2025, position frames boycotts as a valid exercise of faculty agency. This raises, in my mind, a critical question. If the AAUP endorses faculty-led pressure as a legitimate tactic, why do they remain so critical of donor-led pressures? Faculty often critique donor influence as weaponized philanthropy. While anecdotal accounts of donor overreach certainly exist, empirical research shows that donor leverage is vastly contingent and localized, such as earmarks for scholarships, supporting faculty research, or the like, rather than systematic influence. Nonetheless, as we were talking about just outside during lunch, the mere perception of donor control or threat or coercion can impact faculty freedom and act as a chilling effect. If the justification of boycotts is principled opposition to what some in American academia and elsewhere are calling genocide, that principle should be applied consistently. The AUP made no policy changes regarding the Uyghur genocide, despite China's significant material influence, on US campuses and US campus budgets. This selective timing risks making the stance appear politicized rather than rooted in universal standards. As you can see here, $2.32 billion in contracts come from China. You can imagine that the influence of the Israeli taxpayer on US higher education is a tad lower. By a tad, I mean significantly. So where does this take us? As we've been talking about throughout today, and I certainly agree, academic freedom is not just a right. It comes with the responsibility to remain grounded in scholarly rigor. When faculty advocate for boycotts outside of their disciplinary expertise, their advocacy is based on personal conviction. Sigal Ben Parath, who is now at the University of Pennsylvania, but was on the faculty at at Tel Aviv, calls for epistemic humility, reminding us that using academic freedom as a shield of the ideology can damage our institutional credibility. This really impacts public trust. Public trust in US higher education has been plummeting for over the past decade. It's what guarantees us our ability to continue to do our work and to continue to ask both our states and our federal government to invest in them. I will say that interestingly, after the attacks that have been going on by the current Trump administration, there has been a set of polling on public trust of higher education, and there is a slight uptick. So there might be a backlash to President Trump's actions, although all of us who are social scientists know that one point does not make a line, so we need a couple more years of evidence to see if there is regaining trust. We must move beyond the binary of bounded insiders versus unaccountable outsiders. If faculty can influence both their own institutions and other institutions through protest, we must accept that our alumni, the very critical thinkers we educated, may exercise their influence through philanthropy, because we have consistently talked, at least in the United States, around alumni discourse, that they are part of the community and it's an extension of lifelong learning. Both forms of activism therefore reflect the pluralism essential to a university's mission. The key here is that we can't have false binaries, and we must institute scrutiny consistently. So in conclusion, to preserve public trust, universities must resist these false binaries and embrace a pluralistic ethic, as I was just saying. This means applying consistent standards of transparency and accountability to all financial influence, whether it comes from a donor or from a faculty campaign or BDS. Only then we can ensure that institutional decisions reflect scholarly values rather than political expediency. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Noah. Really interesting issue. We will have a discussion after we conclude all the presentations. Next presentation will be by Professor Ken Levy, who is with us via Zoom. Ken is from Louisiana State University, and his presentation is unusual in our set of talks. Most of the presentations discuss the issues from distant, we discuss issues from a general perspective, but Ken will share with us his personal experience regarding issue of academic freedom. Ken is a tenured full professor at Louisiana State University Law School, but currently, from reasons that we will hear in a minute, he is a visiting professor at Cleveland State University College of Law. Ken's primary research interests are criminal law, criminal theory, constitutional law, and philosophy. He published extensively, and his recent book is Free Will, Responsibility and Crime, an Introduction. Ken, thank you for joining us. The floor is yours for about 15 minutes. Let's see if we can arrange things here.
Right. Thank you. Can you all hear me?
Yes, we will see you in a minute. Just a second, Ken. Okay, yeah, you can go ahead. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, Roy, and thank you for allowing me to participate remotely. I'm sorry I couldn't be there with you, and it looks like a lot of interesting talks. So I'm especially regretting that I couldn't make it. In any event, I think what I'm just going to do is tell you my story, and we can, I have some scholarly content in my paper, but really the story is the primary reason I'm here and talking about this. So, as Roy said, I was tenured, and my animals are starting to bother me. So, I was tenured in 2015, and for a decade it was great. And then in my very first class ever teaching criminal procedure, this is going back to this is almost a year ago, January 14, 2025. I was going through the syllabus, and I told them they may not record or distribute recordings of my class because, and then I explained why. I had this rule in my syllabi before. I had to take it out for COVID, and I never put it back in until the governor of Louisiana came down on one of my colleagues 2 months earlier. One of my colleagues, the day after the presidential election, basically asked his class to be kind, the Trump supporters in his class to be kind and respectful to their fellow students who are not Trump supporters. And he said this in a kind of meandering way, but the message was clear. That it was on Zoom, and one of the students sent this to the governor, and the governor blast tweeted it, excuse me, and said that LSU should not be allowing this, something to the effect of LSU should not be allowing professors to talk like this. He's defying the will of whatever number of millions of Americans that had voted for Trump. Well, this pissed me off, and nothing. Now that professor was never punished, although the governor allegedly was demanding it. And there's a whole backstory there. 2 months later, I was telling them, you may not do that. And I joke a lot in class. And I jokingly said, so if I said, fuck the governor, I wouldn't want that to get back to him. And they all laughed. And the proof that they all laughed, it came out on audio. Little did I know, and most professors at LSU didn't know, students were using a program called Glean, or some students were using a program called Glean that provides our text of the class in real time and has a backup audio. And so I didn't know this until several days after I was suspended on January 18th, 4 days later. And so I was very happy that there was a transcript. And the transcript was very rough. It didn't contain much of the swears, but kind of bleep them, starred them. But then the audio, then we learned, or I learned that we all kind of learned as a community that there was audio, and that in the end saved me because it showed exactly what I said, and I thought it could expedite the investigation because they said they suspended me 4 days later on the basis of allegedly inappropriate remarks, and they needed to conduct an investigation. When I realized there was audio, I'm like, they can do this investigation in an hour and 20 minutes. That's how long the class was. But in any event, I said F the governor in a joke, and then later I criticized Trump and the incoming administration and the Supreme Court. I was basically saying, you know, we're about to learn about all our rights, Fourth, Fifth, and Sixth Amendment rights, but I am worried that the incoming administration is going to gut them, especially with the help of the current Supreme Court. In referencing Trump, I said, I still can't believe that fucker won. And so I used the F word twice, and I criticized both the governor and Trump. Well, what happened is I left that class, you know, an hour and 20 minutes. My first time teaching it. I was a little nervous, you know, but I thought it was great. The students were involved, and it was, you know, I was very excited. I got a email the next morning from the dean saying she'd like to meet with me, and she said, "Am I available the next day, the Thursday?" So I taught my first class Tuesday. She said, "Are you available Thursday?" I said, "Sure. I have office hours in the morning." She said, "I'll swing by." I didn't know what this is about. I actually thought it was about something totally different. The associate dean called me that night and said, "It's about some remarks you made in class." And I don't really remember how much detail she went into, but I thought, oh, well, I can deal with that. I've been doing, you know, I've been doing media interviews for years. And I talk mostly about criminal law, criminal procedure stuff. And I've gotten some pushback from people in the community saying, you know, but I've never gotten in trouble, and I figured this is the same. I mean, I've been saying, I said, I drop the F-bomb every once in a while, twice in that class, and just so you know, many law professors I've been told over the last year, they also use a lot of bad words. I think it's part of the law culture. So in any event, she just told me it was about remarks. So I had a good relationship with the dean. So the next morning, the dean basically and I talked about. She said, "You are accused of saying X, Y, and Z," and I said, "Well, actually," and I clarified, no. And one of the things she said is that that I had threatened my students with lawsuits, and I said, "Whoa." Who walks into their first class of the semester, especially after teaching for really 18 years, because I taught 2 years of legal research and writing, who walks into their first class and threatens their students at all, no less with lawsuits? So I said, I don't know where that comes from, but the best I can make out is that I told them they may not record or distribute to class, and if somebody interpreted that as me suing them, that's on them, not on me. It came out later that I had threatened them, quote unquote, threatened them with jail, because when I was wrapping up my spiel about you may not record, distribute to class, I said, and if you do, I am personally authorized to arrest and jail you. And again, they all laughed. And first of all, these are students who had taken criminal law, and now we're in a criminal procedure class. So, and I deliver, it was just obvious it was a joke. It was one of like 20 jokes I told in that class. I was very proud of this transcript that came out because I think there were a lot of funny lines in there. But that turned into, LSU turned that into, he threatened his students with jail. But initially she said it was lawsuits, and I didn't know where that came from. So, and by the way, because I didn't know where that came from, and she had said lawsuits, not jail, I was later accused of lying to the dean because I didn't mention jail. my jail jail. And I didn't have any memory of it. When the transcript came out, I was like, oh, I said that. It's a good exercise if you ever want to see how little you remember from a class. Just have somebody record it by Glean or any other software, and there's a lot in there. It's like, oh yeah, I remember saying that. Oh yeah, I remember saying that. There were even some things I didn't remember saying. But in any event, I went and taught my second class of criminal procedure, and it went fine. And I didn't drop the F-bomb. Was more careful, because one of the things that Dean and I discussed, she said, could you tone down the cursing? I said, no problem. So I taught my first advanced crim class, I think that day as well. So 2 days later on a Saturday, so then on Friday, the day after, the dean calls me, leaves a message, I call her back, and she says, HR wants to meet with you tomorrow, which was a Saturday at noon. So I said, oh God, okay. Called her back after talking to some people. I said, can you postpone the meeting so that I can get a lawyer? And she said she'll see what she can do. Well, she never called me back. The next morning comes, and so I emailed her, what's basically, I'd like to reiterate that I would like a lawyer, attend this meeting with me, and she didn't respond. So I went to the meeting, and I had a colleague accompany me. They didn't show up, but on the way there, I got a letter saying, you've been suspended indefinitely for quote-unquote inappropriate remarks in class, and there's going to be an investigation. They also said I'm welcome on campus, so clearly my threat was not so severe that I was banned from campus. So what happened after that is litigation. I got a lawyer. The students organized spontaneously. They had a rally, they had a petition, they started to GoFundMe for my litigation. But I sued LSU for a temporary restraining order and a preliminary injunction, and I won both. We had a hearing in mid-February, 2-day hearing. Lots of witnesses testified, mostly for me, and I won the preliminary injunction, but everything after that, I've lost. The First Circuit, the Court of Appeal in Louisiana, stayed the TRO. They stayed and then a week later reversed the preliminary injunction. Since then it's been appeals, LSU appeal, they First Circuit granted their appeal. Louisiana Supreme Court declined to consider my appeal of that kind of strand of litigation. And what's going on right now is that LSU in June appealed. It's not terribly important. They appealed something that happened at the trial court. The trial court denied one of their two exceptions, the exception of prematurity. They said, LSU was saying I brought my case too early. I should have let LSU kind of run this investigation for months while I'm suspended. And I said, so I brought a case before it was right. The First Circuit granted LSU's appeal, and they didn't even, so we argued, they violated my due process rights. They didn't even give me notice or a hearing, and they violated my free speech rights, and tenure, and academic freedom. So we had, very strong arguments. The First Circuit said they didn't deny Levy's due process, case closed, and dismissed my case, and assessed the cost to me. My lawyer says they didn't even, they didn't even address free speech, didn't touch it. So we made a motion for reconsideration. Could you at least address the free speech issue? And they said deny, one word, deny, no explanation. So we appealed that to the Louisiana Supreme Court, and we're hoping they take the case. But the track record so far for the First Circuit and the Supreme Court has been dismal. If they take the case, great, we'll argue it, hope to win. But it's Louisiana, I don't have high hopes. If I lose, either they don't take the case, this is all injunctive relief, but if they don't take the case, or they rule against me, then LSU can, if it wants, move to terminate me. And so the last, I guess I'll wrap it up. I mean, and we can talk about this more, but the last 12 months, I mean, it's been almost a year now, have been hell. It's been a nightmare. Even though I'm at CSU and I'm loving it, and I'm loving it, they've welcomed me, they've been nothing but hospitable and kind, and so that's all going well. It's a visiting position. It's not permanent, so I haven't really had job security now for over a year. This is 10 years after I earned tenure. But so financially, emotionally, I just my everything's uncertain now. And there's so much more to say about LSU's bad conduct. The chilling effect has been terrible at LSU, I'm told, and throughout really Louisiana. What happens in my case has implications for every public university faculty there, and really private university faculty too, because they don't even have to abide by the First Amendment. So, you know, the private schools tend more or less to follow the First Amendment norms. But if the public universities can do this to me, a tenured professor, who all I did was criticize two public officials. I used profanity too, but that doesn't, there's no rule against profanity at LSU or really anywhere else. So if they can do this to me, a tenured professor, just yank me from the classroom because the governor doesn't like my political remarks, they can do this to anybody for any reason. And so it's just a very dire situation for me and for Louisiana.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Ken, for sharing with us your story. There's a lot to talk here, but we'll leave it to a discussion. And of course, we hope that things will get out better. We continue with Alexander Sasha Volokh presentation that deals with involvement of governments in setting universities' codes. Sasha is a professor of law at the Emory University School of Law. He was a visiting professor at the Georgetown University Law Center and at the Houston Law Center before coming to Emory. And Sasha will share with us his thoughts about universities' First Amendment right to restrict speech. Sasha, thanks for joining us. The floor is yours.
Thanks very much. Can everyone hear me fine?
Yes, yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, just a little bit of background. I have, for some years, been very much pro-university free speech advocate. I'm very active within my own university's free speech watchdog organization. I'm the chair of the Emory's Committee for Open Expression, which safeguards Emory's own open expression policy. Emory is a private university, so doesn't have to comply with the First Amendment, but it sort of voluntarily commits itself to the First Amendment, and I'm a big fan of that. So I've always been an advocate of very robust First Amendment rights at public universities and voluntary First Amendment-like rights at private universities. Nonetheless, my view is that at private universities, I think not only is it true that private universities are not bound by the First Amendment, so private universities do have a legal right to be as illiberal as they want, but there are some places, like for example, in California, there's the so-called Leonard Law. The Leonard Law actually mandates that private universities must obey the First Amendment. That's weird, that's unusual. So that means, you know, UC Berkeley is a public university, so it automatically has to obey the First Amendment, but Stanford, private university, has to obey the First Amendment because of this state statute. Anyway, I think that's a horrible idea. Not only is it a horrible idea, but I think it violates the First Amendment rights of the university itself. And so part of my thesis is that the First Amendment right, it's important to be clear about what is the rights holding entity in this case. And so let's suppose if I were a professor at Stanford, and Stanford said, you can't take X position, and then I do take that position. If I claim a First Amendment right, according to the Leonard Law, I think that's incorrect, because actually the First Amendment right is held by the university. So the universities have, under the First Amendment, associational freedoms, associational rights. The U.S. Supreme Court has long protected associational rights, that people not only have First Amendment rights, but they can also come together to create organizations to exercise First Amendment rights together. So Stanford University is an organization that is owned by trustees, or what is their governance structure. And so Stanford University has its own First Amendment rights. And those First Amendment rights can include a commitment to speak in X, Y, and Z ways. And they have a right to exclude people who do not comply with that ideological vision if they want to. Now, I think that's a horrible idea for universities to do that, so I don't think they ought to. But I think that it is deeply unjust for governments to force universities into a First Amendment model, because basically the government thinks that they are protecting the free speech rights of the employees, the students, and so on. And I say no, those rights are completely illusory, because no one has the right to be on Stanford's campus. You only are on Stanford's campus if they let you on, because we have capitalism, we have private property. And so when you come onto Stanford's campus, you should be able to waive those rights if Stanford wants you to. And so I think Stanford's rights are actually paramount here. Stanford is, properly speaking, the proper rights holder here. And so the first half of my thesis is this, that private universities have, not only do they in fact have the legal right to discriminate ideologically, but it should be thought of as their own very strong First Amendment right to discriminate ideologically. And so that if some state or the federal government or whatever wants to mandate that they protect their own constituents' rights, I think that's deeply wrong. And so this is, by the way, not only a matter of California with the Leonard Law, but also the ABA, the American Bar Association, which accredits law schools. Recently it's been insisting that law schools, as a condition of accreditation, adopt free speech policies. This is their so-called Standard 208. And so my law school has adopted a law school-specific free speech standard pursuant to ABA Standard 208. In our case, it was easy, because we have an open expression policy university-wide, so we just basically incorporated that. This is complicated because the ABA is technically a private organization, but state law gives their decisions coercive effect, because you can't actually, at least in Georgia, you can't even be a lawyer unless you graduate from an ABA-accredited law school. And so I think at some level, somebody is forcing on the university that they have to have a free speech policy, and I think that violates the free speech rights of the university itself. So, big picture, it's important to properly conceptualize whose rights are at issue, and in a private university context, I would say that the students, the faculty, they just don't have rights, because they waive the rights by virtue of their contract with the entity. And it's actually the entity that has First Amendment rights. Okay, that's part one of my thesis. Part two of my thesis is, you might say, well, at least this doesn't apply to public universities, right? And I would say, even in public universities, I think we professors properly have fewer rights than we may think. And here is why. So the rights of professors under the First Amendment, there's a late 1960s basic precedent about government employee speech is a case called Pickering. Pickering says that government employees retain First Amendment rights, even though they're government employees, but you do a weighing, you do a balancing between the employee interest and the government interest. And, essentially, if you're speaking on the job, or if you're speaking on the job as part of your job-related duties, your interests are very low, and the employer's interests are very high. On the other hand, if you're at home, on social media, doing something unrelated, like opining on Russia, Ukraine, or Israel, Palestine, or whatever, that has nothing to do with your teaching responsibilities, and in those circumstances, the employee's interest is very high, and the university's interest is very low. So it's kind of a balancing. And it's all an example of a broader doctrine, which is called the unconstitutional conditions doctrine, which is that the government is allowed to impose certain restraints as a condition of the contract that they make with you, but that power is not unlimited. It has to be, roughly speaking, reasonable, germane to the government's interest. 2006, the Supreme Court decided a case called Garcetti v. Ceballos. And Garcetti v. Ceballos basically said that if you are actually not only speaking on the job, but it's your own job-related speech, in that context, your First Amendment rights are very low to non-existent. And actually, it's the government employer's rights that are absolutely paramount. Now, I think that's basically correct. But one thing that the court did is they bracketed academic freedom issues. They said that this case is not about academic freedom. Garcetti v. Ceballos involved a prosecutor's office. And so they said that this is not a case where it's like a professor speaking job-related speech at a university, and in an academic freedom context, that might raise different issues, and so we don't resolve that here. And so the lower courts have been left to resolve that issue on a case-by-case basis. My view, though, is that the Garcetti v. Ceballos reasoning is just as valid in an academic context as in a non-academic context. And again, I think the key is to think, what is the appropriate entity here? And the Supreme Court has always said, and I think rightly so, that the government is allowed to speak. There's the government speech doctrine, is the government can say whatever it wants. And the government does not have to be even-handed. The government is allowed to say racism is bad. And it does not have to itself give equal time to the view that racism is good. Now, I mean, it can't prevent you from publishing Mein Kampf. I think everyone should be able to read Mein Kampf privately and publish it and say that they agree with it. But the government itself in its own speech does not have to endorse both positions. The government can always take its own position saying, we support Ukraine, or we support recycling, or we oppose racism. Here's our view of who was right in the Civil War, or whatever. But here's the thing, the government is an abstract entity. The government cannot speak by itself. The government can only speak by getting agents to speak for it. So, for example, it can hire a spokesman or something like that. So whenever you have a government employee speaking as part of the government job, you should think of that as essentially a form of government speech. And I think that the government is fully has the power to say, this is the position that we want expressed in our classrooms, and if you want a job in our classrooms, you must say exactly X, Y, and Z. We are entitled to make you a complete mouthpiece for our own ideology. Now again, I think that's a horrible idea. But I think that if the government has a view that it wants its agents to convey, it should be allowed to do that. And again, the private professor like you and me, we should be able to waive our own rights as a condition of entering into this contract. Now, the unconstitutional conditions doctrine puts limitations on that, but I think one case where I think that's always valid is if the government has its own program that it wants to implement and it wants to pay someone in order to participate in that very program. Right? Like if it wants to do a pro-recycling program and it wants to hire spokespeople for the pro-recycling program, it's entitled to say, well, while you're speaking in our program, you must say pro-recycling things. So that's always a proper application of the unconstitutional conditions doctrine. So I think that at least professors, as far as their in-class speech goes, I think essentially their rights are properly waived, and the right, whether you want to think of it as a right or a power, belongs to the public university. So again, I think it's key to one needs to be clear about what is the appropriate entity involved. And so here, I think it's the public university that has the power to convey a message, and the private individuals are properly just thought of as having waived their rights by their agreement to participate in that program. So this has some other what stems from this. One is that if the university voluntarily chooses to commit itself to free speech norms, then I think that's very different. And almost every university, as the organization FIRE documents, that almost every university has a policy where at least they pay lip service to free speech norms. And so if a university, hypothetically, like my university, adopted a strong free speech policy, then I think there we could say, well, that's different because there the university has disclaimed has disclaimed any view that our professors are mouthpieces. But if again, here we're talking about public universities, but if a public university wanted to say, actually, to this extent, they are mouthpieces, I think they ought to be able to do that. I think the same is true, by the way, of libraries. I think that the content of a library is also government speech. That is, people talk about how books are being banned. I think that in most cases that I've looked at, maybe all cases that I've seen, there's no ban at all. There's no book that you can't buy through Amazon or access on the internet. It's just that they want to pull a book from the library. The library does not have room to contain all books. The library is essentially the government, the school libraries, like the government schools, choice of here are the materials that we want to make available to our students. That again, that's just ought to be an expression of the views that the government wants to take. They can carry books that take the anti-Confederacy view of the Civil War, and they do not have to give equal time to books that take the pro-Confederacy side. So, bottom line is, my thesis is, whether we're talking about public universities or private universities, I think that we should think of those universities as a First Amendment matter, as having very, very broad authority to cut down on the speech of their constituents, at least their professors in the classroom. And so I think of this as the university's First Amendment right to impose speech codes. I think that is, in almost all cases, going to be a horrible idea, but I think that universities do have the right to do that. So that's my thesis, and thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you, Sasha. So yeah, we heard two different opinions on this subject about what the law is or what the law should be. We'll hold our discussion for just after the last presentation, and it deals with a similar issue about the power to impose regulations of speech at universities. And we will hear Eti Zaltman. Eti Zaltman is a PhD candidate in the Department of Political Science at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. And Eti's thesis is about regulation for quality, comparative multi-level analysis of government reforms in higher education, and her talk will focus on the issue of regulating academic speech, governance structures, spheres of the boundaries of academic expression in Israel. Eti, please.
Hello everyone. So today I want to share with you research that I did about the academic freedom of speech and attempt to modify it in 2017. Actually this, my presentation.
Maybe we should share it.
Uh,
Never mind.
Take it away.
So actually this research based on my master's dissertation, which was by the supervision of Professor Levy. So my research focuses on a phenomenon we see in many countries, which is attempts by politicians to limit academic speech in academia. And historically in Israel, the relationships between the left-wing academia and right-wing ruling parties were complicated, and sometimes they're translated into debates, protests, and even administrative challenges within the campuses. And in 2017, Naftali Bennett became the Minister of Education and Chair of the Council for Higher Education. And then he faced with a new external initiative by a right-wing organization which called Intilzu. A call center opened for students, so students can call and report about criticism of government if they heard something like this in the campus. And at this point, Naftali Bennett understood the relationships between left-wing academia and right-wing government as a problem, and he wanted to promote a solution to solve this problem, a solution according to his opinion. And the solution was to writing a code of ethics for the Israeli academic institutions. For this task, Naftali Bennett connected to Professor Sasha. And with Professor Sasha, Professor Sasha and Naftali Bennett had known each other from the last position of Naftali Bennett, the Minister of Security. And when Naftali Bennett was the Minister of Security, he initiated to writing a code of ethics for the Israeli army, the IDF. And who wrote this code of ethics for the IDF? Professor Sasha. So Naftali Bennett wanted to promote a solution to the left-wing academia, and he chose solutions that he had used before, writing the code of ethics. And he chose a writer that he had known before, Professor Sasha. And Professor Sasha indeed wrote a detailed and centralized code of ethics, something like 7 pages with very detailed code, included clearer rules about what academic members can say in class, and especially what they cannot. This code of ethics was centralized in that it obligated the institutions to comply with it. And then Naftali Bennett presented his code of ethics to the Council for Higher Education, and a broad and visible opposition was created against Bennett's initiative. The opposition included students, faculty members, heads of universities, citizens, and the media. With this opposition, Naftali Bennett couldn't implement his initiative, and at this point, the regulators in the Council for Higher Education came to help him. How? They established a subcommittee in the Council for Higher Education, especially to discuss this code of ethics. Naftali Bennett was not a member in this subcommittee, but senior academics and a few members of the Council for Higher Education were members. These members was presented different opinion against and for the initiative. And this subcommittee discussed and formulated a short list of broad principles, and these principles didn't have mandatory adoption. The subcommittee presented their version of Code of Ethics, the ethics principles, to Naftali Bennett and to his heads of universities, and then as regulators and senior academics, they managed to convince Naftali Bennett and heads of universities to settle and accept this version of Code of Ethics, these ethics principles, are the Code of Ethics. Naftali Bennett settled because he wanted to show that he influenced the speech of left-wing academia. And the heads of universities settled because it promised them that the centralized and detailed Code of Ethics will not be implemented, the original initiative. Okay, interesting story so far, no?
Very.
Okay. But we're not finished. Actually, we only started. Why? Because in my research, I looked at the, I looked for these ethics principles in the university's procedures, and I was surprised to find that some universities have adopted only parts of these principles, but others haven't adopted any. So at this point, I think that you would agree with me that the outcome of this initiative was extremely symbolic. We see the following trajectory. We started with ambitious and precise Code of Ethics, which was translated into broad principles. And regarding implementation, we see minimal implementation. So, as a result, the initiative led to an extremely symbolic outcome rather than substantive transformation of academic freedom. And this leads me directly to my research questions. In my first research question, I asked what were the regulatory procedures in the 2017 attempt to impose Code of Ethics for Israeli academia. And I think that at this point, after all the story and all the juice and all the details, you know the answer. In my second research question, I asked how can we characterize the initiative and its outcome. And as I said, I characterized the initiative as symbolic, as an ambitious initiative, and its outcome as a symbolic one. And in my third research question, the important one, I looked at the initiative, its outcome, and the gap between them. And I asked, what can explain this gap? And for this research question, I formulated 3 hypotheses. So the first explanatory factor that I thought about is distribution of political control. And what do I mean? I mean that in higher education, in the Israeli higher education system, the power is distributed among politicians, regulators, and academia. And this situation limits the ability of politicians to be involved in the system and to lead policy change. So when Naftali Bennett didn't have the authority of regulators and academia, he couldn't implement his initiative. The second explanatory factor that I thought of is interested parties. In this case, we saw many interest groups united against Naftali Bennett initiative. These interest groups included faculty members from many types of academic institutions, and students, and heads of universities, and citizens, and the media. And all these interest groups did what they could to oppose Naftali Bennett initiative. And my third explanatory factor is policy feedback. This is a little bit more of a challenge, but I will try to explain it regarding this case study. Policy feedback in this case study means that the Israeli perception of academic freedom and free speech in academia is a sensitive value. So any initiative to limit academic freedom or free speech in academia will get negative policy feedback. Maybe in other words, anytime that in Israel that somebody tries to change something in academic freedom or to limit in some way the free speech in academia, it will be pushed back. You are not agreed? Okay. To conclude, the case shows that academic freedom in Israel is not only legislated, but also shaped by how power is organized. Divided authority, united interest groups, and strong social meaning of academic freedom together turns ambitious political interventions into symbolic outcomes. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Nancy. Okay, we have about 15 minutes for discussion. So I suggest that we'll collect the comments and then the four speakers will be able to respond both to each other and to issues that are raised here. There's some echo here. Yes, please.
Yeah, thank you so much for all of the presentations. Very provoking and interesting. I really appreciated Noah's very original approach to bringing BDS and donor structures in the US into dialogue. I had the impression, however, that there was an asymmetry in bringing apples and oranges into dialogue, because as far as I know, there are over 3,000 institutes of higher education in the US, and I'm not aware, other than Sonoma State, that actually the president adopted BDS or tried to, and was either forced into leave or retire. He was, yeah. So I'm not aware of any other institute of higher education in the US that adopted BDS. However, I know that donors have had a lot of influence on decisions with regard to ending academic appointments, closing departments, abolishing positions, firing presidents. I'm thinking of Bill Ackman at Harvard, how powerful his donor pressure has been. I'm thinking of University of Philadelphia, Columbia University. I mean, there are a number of very prominent cases where donor pressure has really led to changes of policy and has had real input on academic structures and restructuring. For BDS, I'm only aware that student governances and some academic organizations have adopted the BDS resolution.
I think you're right that there are very few. It's not just Sonoma State. Off the top of my head, also Union Theological Seminary has also officially adopted BDS and divested from their endowment from Israeli institutions and corporations. I think that there are a couple of others, but you're correct that it's a very small number.
There's more in Europe. There are more in
There
Europe.
are certainly more.
The situation's different.
Yeah.
I'm open to guess.
I take your point around the perception of donor influence being greater. I think it's mostly about perception, and when we actually look at if we were to look to try to quantify it through empirical study, the level of influence is not there. There's plenty of isolated examples. I think it's fair to question Ackerman's pressure campaign, not just as a donor, but also surfacing plagiarism claims and things like that to the ouster at Harvard. But I would also think that if we look at the University of Pennsylvania and other presidents that left, some of that was their own doing as well. Yes, there was campaigns to push them out, but also their speech at Congress led to the loss of support there. So I think that there's fair level to critique where donor influence comes in and where donor influence does not come in, what actually led to the ouster, what actually led to conversations about the only conversations that I know about whether faculty would be hired or not were prior to October 7th. I think it's worthy of scrutiny, and therefore also worthy of setting up a process at institutions that look at how those decisions are being made and where the proper line, the ethical line is for an institution in order to move away from a donor or move away from a petition that's coming from faculty towards BDS. That's what I'm claiming, is that we need to set up clear transparency through gift agreements and be clear about the decision-making process that is being made in hiring, in firing, in the decisions of how to adopt curricula, etc.
I'm actually very interested in the empirical data. I have only anecdotal data, and I know of many professors who lost their positions because of donor pressure. My own university, I know that donors have raised $10 million, and they have for Israel studies, and they have very clear objectives. And I would be very interested in seeing where this will go. I mean, our administration has signed agreements with the Trump administration and has taken very strong stance on what has to be policed, what kind of speech with regard to Israel. And I'm also aware that there have been, but again, that's very anecdotal, that there are a lot of universities where there has been student protests, faculty protests to disinvest from Israeli armed industry, and it hasn't been successful. But again, this is very anecdotal, so I would be very interested in the empirical data.
Plausibly, they would have a breach of contract claim against the university. So even though I think the university has a right to be a liberal, I think they just they have very wisely chosen not to exercise all of those rights. And in fact, on the contrary, they have chosen voluntarily to grant more rights, which I think is great. As far as students, I think for private universities, my analysis would say that students, private universities should have the right to be as illiberal as they want, not only with respect to their professors, but also with respect to their students. They might say, unless you are totally committed to social justice, we don't want you here. And if you voted for Trump, get out of here. Now, as far as public universities, my analysis does not apply to students. I think that professors in their classroom speech, and possibly in our research, but certainly in our classroom speech, the government is allowed to say, yes, we have some views that we want to express, and we are hiring you to be our mouthpieces. Students are not the mouthpieces. Students are more like they're the recipients of the message. So I think the government has a strong power to engage in government speech, and it can hire agents to transmit the government speech, and that's us professors. And so I think that we professors in our classroom speech rightly don't have a lot of rights, but I think that analysis does not apply to students. I think my analysis would still say that students do retain their First Amendment rights, and I think probably the Pickering test is pretty much correct when it comes to that. I would also say, by the way, by way of footnote, that everything I say is in my very strongly supporting Ken, because I think that whatever universities do, they have to comply with due process. And also I think that if the university had adopted a very clear speech-restricted rule, then I would say, yeah, go ahead. But in this, I think in Ken's case, the university had not adopted a clear rule, and so I think that violates Ken's rights in all sorts of ways. So anyway, even though I believe what I believe, but I also support Ken. I don't want to say.
Yeah, but there is an issue here, because it seems that, Sasha, you may assume what needs to be proved, in the sense that, well, the argument that we faculty members are agents for transmitting government speech is a possibility, but it is a questionable one. One may argue that no, our role, our social role, is completely different, because if we were agents for transmitting government speech, it would contradict the very idea of academic freedom. Why do we have academic freedom? And from a functional perspective, the concern is that the government may use this power that we assume that it has for the very purpose as it used against Ken, to prevent criticism against the government. It is an important social function of universities, of faculty members, to serve as those who offer criticism of government policies, and we might lose this capacity of us as faculty if we are subject to at will of the government. If the government is willing to accept criticism against it, well, we can do that, but it might be the case that they will not be so generous in their willingness to accept criticism. So how do we resolve this possible conflict there?
Yeah, so I guess I wouldn't say I'm assuming what needs to be proved. What I would say is that I wouldn't necessarily assume that we are mouthpieces of the government. Of course, I'm at a private university, but hypothetically, if I were a public university, I wouldn't assume that I am a mouthpiece of the government. Why don't I assume that? Because I would know that my university has a free speech policy, and my university supports academic freedom, and it has made lots of statements to that effect. And so because of that, I would not assume that any university professor is a mouthpiece of the government. Nonetheless, I think that even now, to a certain extent, we are the mouthpieces of government policy. Like, for instance, if I were a geology professor, I would assume that I am hired to teach that the earth is round and not flat. All right, now, we're not required to believe that the earth is round, right? We are allowed in society to believe that the earth is flat. But I'm not going to be hired to teach that. And I think that that is perfectly appropriate. And is that the government's ideology? Yes, it is. And is it okay for the government to hire me to teach that ideology? Yes, it is. So to a certain extent, I am the mouthpiece of the government, but yeah, I do assume that on matters of broad social opinion, I'm not the mouthpiece of the government. But I only assume that because we currently have a social understanding of that. But I think that the government controls the terms of its own contract. So if the government decided to clearly say, going forward, prospectively, that henceforth, I expect all of my professors to say that Brown v. Board of Education was correctly decided. And if you believe otherwise, you gotta shut up in the classroom. And if the government said that, clearly, prospectively, then I would say, yeah, like that's gonna be the new deal going forward. And I think that the government has the ability to do that. Now, does that create the possibility that the government is going to use its great economic power to create a de facto orthodoxy? Yes, it does. But I think we already got into that boat when we agreed that there was a government speech doctrine. Like, the government is allowed to speak. The Supreme Court has said, basically, without limit, the government is allowed to say whatever it wants to say. And I think that's absolutely correct. It is never coercive for the government to say what it wants to say. And because the government can only speak through agents, it can never be coercive to hire agents to speak the government's view. Because if you thought that you couldn't, then that's tantamount to saying the government can't speak. And yeah, that does create a risk that the government is going to be able to use its great power to drown out all other voices, or to, just to say you won't be able to participate in this government money unless. And yes, that is a great threat, but I think it's inherent in the government speech doctrine, and I think the government speech doctrine is essentially correct.
Okay, thank you. Before we conclude, I would like to let Ken give his concluding comments, if you like, following the discussion that we had here.
Well, thank you. Yeah, all really interesting thoughts. I guess, yeah, Sasha. I don't fully. I like Sasha's paper. It sounds really interesting. I don't fully disagree. And I should just say, in October 2024, I published an article where I argued that on the one hand, professors have broad free speech rights, public university faculty have broad First Amendment rights, but schools and students also have rights to what I call a fair, inclusive, and welcoming learning environment. And so these rights have to be balanced, and the way I struck the balance was that the free speech rights tend to be paramount and prevail unless it's dehumanizing speech. And then, we could debate the borderline cases of dehumanizing speech, but clearly, I think Sasha kind of he talked about Brown before, but let's say you have a professor at a state university who's advocating white supremacy. And that's the example, one of the examples I used in the paper. Even if that professor is tenured and it's a state university, because that's dehumanizing speech, the university has the right, and the students have the right to censor that, or to suppress that speech. But it's a balancing. I don't get into government speech doctrine. I think that's another way to come at it, and I'm not fully opposed to it. I'd have to think more about it. I'd like this, Sasha, if you don't mind sending me the paper. But so I think that there's a broad agreement, though. They got to give you due process. At least state universities do. They got to give you notice of the hearing, and our free speech rights are broad, and our academic freedom rights are broad. At least now, given bylaws and the current constitutional, jurisprudence. So I think we're all in agreement on that. But we live in scary times, and who knows what the courts are going to say about these kinds of things. So,
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Noah, Ken, Sasha, and Eti for these discussions. And Ken, we all share the hope that things will go right and you will be able to return to your original position. So thank you all, and I think we continue in the